All right, welcome. So I'm going to try to finish the Old Testament tonight. We've done most of the 46 books, some much more thoroughly than others. But for a quick review, there's 4 sections of the Old Testament. The Torah, or Pentateuch, which means the first 5 books. Of those 5, we just did Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy means second telling. Deuteronomy retells what happened in Exodus. So if you do Deuteronomy, you kind of know what happened in Exodus and even in Leviticus and Numbers. Didn't do Genesis, for reasons that we'll go over later. Then we did the historical section, which we did pretty thoroughly, which was Joshua leading the people into the Promised Land, the judges who led local tribes for a while, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel leading us up to Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, high point under David and Solomon, and then the decline of the empire. 1st and 2nd Chronicles covered the same time period. After the decline of the empire and the dissolution of it, later on, we get to come back and cover that under Ezra and Nehemiah. And actually, we're going to cover then what happened after them at the beginning of tonight, because what happens in Maccabees sets the tone, provides a setting for what I call the storybooks. But anyway, so most Bibles, they'd say like there's 4 parts. The first part is your Torah, or Pentateuch, the first 5 books. The historical section, we just went over. Special section for the prophets. We went over many of the prophets, basically what their messages were. Remember, for example, Micah and Isaiah and Amos said, hey, besides, it's not just worshiping the right God, it's treating your neighbor well, helping the poor, and that kind of stuff. And when people weren't doing that, they weren't following God's plan. So we covered many of the prophets and what their messages were to the people of Israel. And then last week, we did what the Jews call the writings, what we call the wisdom literature. And we covered 7 books there, and I told you that when people do their individual reading, that's probably the easiest books to read, and it's a lot of practical things as far as living out your ordinary life, and including our belief system with God in that. And I think I mentioned if you did spiritual reading on your own, those 7 books would probably be the best ones to do that, because they're easiest to understand, and they are very practical, and give some common sense things. Your Bible doesn't have a 5th section, but I kind of say that there is, and I call that the story book section. And we have done 2 of those already, Ruth and Jonah. And the reason we did those is because they were so much opposite of what we had heard in the historical section. And the other ones that I would put in the storybook section would be Daniel, Tobit, Esther, and Judith. So we'll cover those very briefly tonight. Those books primarily are written, though, as a response to some of the bad things that happened later on during the time of the Greek occupation, which are covered in 1 and 2 Maccabees. So when we did the historical section, we went through 1 and 2 Kings, and then we picked up Ezra and Nehemiah, but we didn't do 1 and 2 Maccabees yet. So that's what we're going to start with tonight. And remember, Maccabees is not in the Hebrew Bible, for the simple reason that it's later. The Hebrew Bible, we tried to end around 400 BC. And remember, some of those wisdom books, namely Sirach and Wisdom, were written later and in Greek. So those 2 books last week that we did are Catholic Bible, but not in the other. And tonight, 1 and 2 Maccabees. And also Judith and Tobit as well. And again, because they're written later and they're written in Greek. But we'll go over those kind of finish off historically what happened to the Jewish people. So remember, right, they're slaves in Egypt. Moses leads them out of slavery. They make a covenant with God on Mount Sinai. Eventually, they make it to the Promised Land. Moses dies just before they enter the Promised Land. Joshua leads them into the Promised Land. There's a lot of fighting going on for a while. When Joshua dies, there's not one leader, but every tribe kind of has its own. They're called judges, and the Bible gives some highlights of some of the judges. Eventually, people say we want a king like other countries, so Samuel appoints Saul as the first king. And then David, the second king. Under David, the Jews were the strongest that they were in the Old Testament period. They remained that way at least at the beginning under Solomon. But then they start to get a little weaker there at the end of that, and when Solomon dies, the kingdom divides into two parts over succession, who's going to succeed Solomon. So the north is called Israel, the south is called Judah. They both get weaker over the next 200 years, and after 200 years, the north gets taken over by Assyria, and later on, Assyria gets taken over by Babylon, but then Babylon takes over the south, Judah as well. In 587 or 6 BC, and they destroy Jerusalem, including the temple. People get exiled to modern Iraq, Babylon back then. About 70 years later, they get to come back. Ezra and Nehemiah are some of the leaders. Nehemiah rebuilding Jerusalem. Ezra in getting this law written down. Much of what's currently in the Bible is under his guidance. And a couple of the prophets then, Haggai and Zechariah, are instrumental in getting the temple rebuilt. So the temple is back, the second temple now. And the Jews are back in their homeland. They're not independent. They're under the Persians. But the Persians, of all the foreign occupiers, treat them the best because they allow freedom of religion. They say, you're under us, but we're not worried about what you believe, so if you want to do that, that's fine. And the time under the Persians at least better than what it was under the Assyrians or the Babylonians. All right, so they're under the Persians for 200 years, and then I believe I wrote down around 331, the Greeks take over the Persians. Therefore, the Holy Land is now under the occupation of Greece from 331 BC to about 63 BC. All right, and the Greeks are known for, if you ever see the word Hellenism, it has nothing to do with hell, it has nothing to do with Helen. Hellenism is simply Greek culture. In that Bible passage in Acts of the Apostles, when it says the Hellenists were saying they weren't being treated as well as the other ones, that's why they came up with Stephen and 6 other men to be deacons. Hellenists would simply be Greek-speaking or Greek background. They weren't being treated as fairly as the others, right? But as far as the empire goes, the other way, the Greek culture spread, and going all the way back to Alexander the Great, kind of had the idea of, we do have the best culture, and be wise for you others to follow it, right? And one of the first things Greeks did whenever they took over a city was build a library so they could share their wisdom. We still have Greek influence in our country. They talk about Greek literature, some of the famous classics, Greek architecture we still have. Eventually, the democracy also came from there. But the time that we're going to cover tonight, not quite as positive there. All right, so when Alexander died, he divided his empire, and it was divided, he didn't have sons, so his empire was divided into 3 main generals. And 2 of the 3 often fight over who gets to control what we now call Israel. So when you're reading about the Ptolemies, Ptolemy, that's an Egyptian word. That's the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire. If you ever see the Seleucids, Seleucid, that is the little farther to the east part, Syria area, that seeks control of what we now call Israel. So 2 of the 3 parts of the empire often argue over who should control Israel. So when you see those names, that's what that's about. When we get to the books of Maccabees, though, we do have a primary villain for them, and that is Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV is a king of Greece. And we do know in our time period it would be the 160s BCE. He wants the Jews to give up their religion and follow the Greek one. You're probably familiar with some of the things, maybe you studied that even in school, some of the Greek gods. And anyway, he says, our culture is good. You guys should be giving up yours and following ours. And anyway, you give up some of these Jewish dietary rules. You don't need to do that. And some of the religious customs. It'd be better to follow ours. So anyway, that is what's happening in 1 and 2 Maccabees. The Greeks are trying to Hellenize the Jews. give up your religion, your culture, and practice ours. And Antiochus is the main person who does that. They call him Antiochus Epiphanes. That's kind of a nickname, it means madman. People that didn't like him called him that. So anyway, he kind of issues this decree. And he gives incentives to Jews who give up their faith and do that. So you get a good high-paying job if you do that. And some people do it. They say, all right, I'll give up my faith and do that. All right. The main leader that says no to that is a guy named Mattathias. And that is the Maccabee family. So basically, in Maccabees, you have the story of Mattathias and his 5 sons leading the resistance against this Jewish attempt, or this Greek attempt to Hellenize the Jews. All right. You can tell who a Jew is in society, especially back then. Okay? Because they ate differently than other people. There were certain foods they wouldn't eat, right? So they have certain dietary habits. They could be caught in possession of the scroll of what we now call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. That would be very obvious. All right? They followed the Sabbath. That was probably the clearest one. You know, on the Sabbath, the Jews didn't do anything other than the basics. All right? And for men, circumcision. Right? So that's 4 things that really stood out that Jews did that was different than the rest of society. So you could tell who a Jew was many times. And anyway, so Jews start to be persecuted. All right, and so the book of Maccabees is basically the attempt of Mattathias and his 5 sons, the Maccabee family, to resist these attempts to Hellenize the Jews. All right, and the story, you can follow it. I always thought this would make an excellent movie. It's got its share of violence, and it's not as gory as some of the earlier books. But it is kind of sad. As the book goes on, eventually the dad and his sons all but one wind up dying in battle, but before they die, they do make some achievements, and they're known through their exploits in these books. And again, Jews would say these are nice books, you know, that tells the heroics of some of our ancestors. It's just they're not in our Bible because it was later and in Greek. So anyway, it talks there in chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees, Mattathias and his sons. And I could certainly go through, and if you wanted to, you could read this, and you could probably follow along. But you have to follow, right, there's battles going on, who's winning, who's losing, and the headings of the chapters give that. One thing that I do want to tell you, though, is this. The worst thing for the Jews that the Greeks did is, when they occupied Jerusalem, remember the Second Temple is there, they put in Greek statues of the Greek gods. So when it talks about the desecration of the temple, that's what it means. The Greek soldiers put in statues of the Greek gods. And of course, this is the holiest building in the world for Jews. It's supposed to be for Yahweh only. You got the Holy of Holies and all that. So yeah, that's really a sad deal. All right, so that one thing that you would all be familiar with today, now you're going to know the historical reason for it, is in, I think it's midway through chapter 4, the Jews regain control of the temple. And they say, all right, we got to get these statues out and rededicate it. So like if someone ever vandalized our church, we would be blessing of it. So anyway, that's what they do here. But anyway, when they get the temple back under their control, they celebrate it for 8 days. And that 8-day celebration is called Hanukkah. I think it's called Hanukkah. So Hanukkah, everybody, first of all, has nothing to do with Christmas. It precedes Christmas by 2 centuries. The only reason people do that, say that, is because it's around the same time of year. It's usually in early December when you celebrate that. But Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the temple. It has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity, because Christianity doesn't exist yet. It has nothing to do with Christmas. has to do with regaining control of the temple and rededicating it after it had been desecrated. So that is talked about there in chapter 4. Judas is a very common name in Israel. So Judas is one of the 5 brothers. So when he said, all right, now that enemies have been crushed, well, just around the temple anyway, we got that back. We have to purify the sanctuary and rededicate it. So it talks about what they did for that, and then in verse 56, for 8 days they celebrated the dedication of the altar and offered holocaust and sacrifices. And then at the end of that paragraph, they decreed that the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness on the anniversary every year for 8 days, from the 25th day of the month of Tislev. Well, the 25th day of Tislev. Remember, the Jewish calendar is a little different. 28 days in a month, because it's a lunar calendar, so that's why it's not the same day every year. But it's usually sometime in December when they celebrate that. So Hanukkah, what we now call Hanukkah, has its origin in what happens in 1, and it's described again in 2nd Maccabees as well. So 1 and 2 Maccabees tell us the origin of it, celebrating for 8 days the rededicating of the temple after it had been desecrated. You can tell by the headings some of the other things that are talked about. Treaties with other people. Some people are saying, well, maybe we should side with the Ptolemies in Egypt. Others, no, maybe we should side with the Seleucids in Syria. Maybe one of them is better than the other. They're fighting over that. Even in chapter 8, they're saying treaty with the Romans. Rome is starting to gain power now. So it's starting to look like they're probably going to be the next empire here pretty soon. They're growing stronger and bigger. So people are noticing that. But anyway, whenever it says death of somebody, you know that that's one of the heroes of it. And by the time we get to the end of the book, I think all but one of them have died. By the end, I think it says John Hyrcanus is the local leader. So some people say they have a period of independence here for a little while until Rome takes over, but it's extremely local. It's certainly they're not any kind of a country to speak of. So anyway, that is what 1 Maccabees is about. Remember, why do we have a 1st Samuel and a 2nd Samuel, the 1st Kings and the 2nd Kings, the 1st Chronicles and the 2nd Chronicles? They were just long books, they divide them in half. Okay, so that's not the case with Maccabees. 1 and 2 Maccabees are 2 separate books, written by 2 different people, but they're written about the same things. So I'll say a little bit. 2nd Maccabees is a little bit more graphic in some of the things because they're going to glorify martyrs. Okay? This is the first time where they're going to say these guys who died for their faith are heroes. And some of these you'll probably recognize from readings on Sunday. So anyway, we're going to have the same setting. It's when the Greeks are occupying and trying to make them follow the Jewish way, or follow the Greek ways. Chapter 4 there says profanation and persecutions, and that includes the desecration of the temple, the city being ravaged in chapter 5, the temple desecrated in chapter 6. So there it says in chapter 6, verse 2, they profaned the temple in Jerusalem and dedicated it to Zeus. And this was an intolerable and utterly disgusting thing. Later on, if they ever talk about the abomination of the temple, that's what it's talking about, when they put the Greek statues in it. All right, now, in the middle of chapter 6, we're going to start hearing the word martyrdom. The guy who wrote 1st Maccabees didn't focus on that. They were heroes, especially the Maccabee family, but they use the word martyr now here. So Eleazar, a man of advanced age, was being forced to eat pork. Okay, obviously we're going to say, gee, what's What's so bad about that? Again, for Jews, you don't eat pork. Okay, and remember, the most obvious way to tell if somebody was a practicing Jew or not was, if you eat pork, all right, you're not. If you refuse, okay, you're obviously standing fast to your Jewish beliefs. So whenever the Greeks wanted to see if somebody was Jew or not, okay, do they practice the Sabbath, whatever, do they have possession of the scriptures, but if you eat pork, then you're obviously not. But anyway, so the heroes here are people who won't give in to that. So Eliezer is the first one of those. And actually, then it says that there's one of the guys who's in charge of this ordeal with him, kind of likes him, and says, okay, listen, I'll give you something that you can eat, and you can eat that. So, and you're not violating your faith that way, and then you don't have to die. But then Eleazar says, okay, thank you, but all the Jews will think that I've given up my faith if I do that. So I won't. So he's put to death. And in chapter 6, verse 23, I believe, and he was older too, which is why the guy didn't really want to kill him, but he acted in an admirable way that, above all, he would be loyal to the holy laws given by God. He even says, yes, I'm ready to go to the abode of the dead. And then a sadder one comes along in chapter 7, which I believe we hear in church every now and then, and that's the one with the mother and her sons, where all of them are put to death one at a time. And at the end, they decide, at least just for the sake of the family, let's not kill the last one, but the mother and the son say, no, we're not giving up our faith. And I think that her last line, though, there's significance here in chapter 7, verse 29. The mother says to her son in 7:29, do not be afraid of this executioner, but be worthy of your brothers and accept death, so that in the time of mercy I may receive you again with them. Why is that line significant? Remember, there's not much belief in an afterlife in the Old Testament. So here's a mother saying, I expect to be with you again. Right, so 2nd Maccabees is theologically significant because the author has a belief in an afterlife. And they're basically saying the reason this makes sense is because good people are being put to death. And there's several other examples of that as well. And the last one even says, what are you waiting for? I'm ready to die. Okay, chapter 8. Okay, there's the story of how the Jews have a few victories and are able to regain the temple. And again, you'll have your reason for Hanukkah there, the celebration of regaining it. And the purification of the temple and city is described in chapter 10. And you see the heading there. Chapter 10, verse 6, the Jews celebrated joyfully for 8 days. As on the Feast of Booths, that's another celebration that they have at another time of year. They're saying, yep, we're going to celebrate here for multiple days to celebrate getting our temple back. All right, so I saw a lot of you nod, recognize the story of the mother and the 7 sons. I think there's a few other ones in there. Somewhere in there, this story of a guy who, the Greeks had elephants. So anyway, he sees the biggest elephant. So he assumes, okay, their military leader is probably on that one. So anyway, he gets under the elephant and kills it with a upward thrust, and the elephant falls on him. So that's how he dies. and somewhere in there, there's a guy named Razis, R-A-Z-I-S. You see that in there. That's an interesting story. He knows he's going to die. He's injured, so he his stomach, but he doesn't die. So he dives off a building onto some people, but he still doesn't die. So anyway, it takes him a while to die. But anyway, so his is a longer martyrdom. Okay, the other significant story, which I read every year on Memorial Day, and you'll see why I say this is the most appropriate story for Memorial Day, because on Memorial Day we remember people who died in service to their country. Okay, so let's take a look at 2 Maccabees chapter 12, the paragraph that begins there with verse 38 until the end. But anyway, we don't have to do it at the very beginning, but Judas is the leader of the Maccabees. Anyway, they just finished the battle. All right, what happens in a battle? Soldiers die. And they say, hey, wait, these are good guys that died. It says they find amulets on some of them. So they're saying, okay, maybe that's why they died. They shouldn't have been wearing these amulets. But either way, they've come to the realization that good people die whenever there's a war. So what are we going to do about this? Well, very significant here is verse 43, I believe. He then took up a collection. So let's take a look at it, because this is a specific Catholic belief that comes from here. Now again, there's other passages about an afterlife, but this one is very clear, and there's a lot of Catholic belief that comes from this little passage. So Judas is he, Judas, the leader of Maccabees, took up a collection among all the soldiers, amounting to 2,000 silver drachmas, which he sent to Jerusalem to provide for an expiatory sacrifice. So this money sent to Jerusalem to the priests there to offer sacrifice on behalf of these soldiers. And the author says, in doing so, he acted in a very excellent and noble way, inasmuch as he had the resurrection of the dead in view. So the author of First Maccabees never said anything specifically about resurrection. Here we actually see the words, resurrection of the dead, for the first time. For if you were not expecting the fallen to rise again, it would have been useless and foolish to pray for them. Why would you pray for someone who's dead if there's no afterlife? But if he did this with a view to the splendid reward that awaits those who had gone to rest in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Thus he made atonement for the dead, that they might be freed from their sin. And that last line is really important too for us as Catholics. Sometimes people say, why do you pray for the dead? It's not in the Bible, okay? Yeah, it's not in the Hebrew Bible or Protestant Bible. We don't have this book. But here it's very clear. They're saying, all right, and again, I kind of like to say, all right, they're using some common sense here. Good people died young. We think there's an afterlife. Those of us who are still alive can pray for those who are dead. And this paragraph is the best job of that. And the reason I'm doing this on Memorial Day, of course, is the reason they died is they died fighting for their country, fighting for their faith. So, the whole idea of believing in another life after this one, believing that good people are rewarded in that life, and praying for those people are all fine. The author encourages it. And I kind of like the part that uses some common sense reasons for that. Yeah, if you didn't believe in another life, it would have been a waste of time to do this. And the whole idea of what many of you do, where you'll say, Father, here, do this, offer a mass for so-and-so. Basically, the origin of that is right here. When they took out the collection, it said, send it to Jerusalem. We obviously can't do it here, we're in a war. Send it to Jerusalem and have the priests offer sacrifice on behalf of the deceased. So if you ever talk with someone who doesn't have this book, I think most Protestants are aware that we get this belief from this passage. And that's fine. They understand that. But anyway, that's why that's just such an important paragraph, because so much of what we believe about the deceased it has its origin there. Obviously, there's other places later on that support that as well. But remember, Book of Wisdom, which we did last time, talked all about the souls of the just are in the hand of God. That's not in the Jewish Bible because it's written later. So there's not much, if anything, in the Hebrew Bible about an afterlife. It only comes along But historically, the reason why they start to figure it out is, okay, these good people that are dying now, I think they're with God. So that is what is significant about that story of Razis that I told you about. That's at the end of chapter 14. So how long it took for him to die, but at the end, I won't even tell you something, how he dies at the end, but he said this was glory because he died dying for his faith. And there's somewhere in here where, after he tells us a story of some gory deaths, he concludes the paragraph by saying, that's enough of those stories. In other words, I've told you enough here. Lots of people died for their faith, but I told you some of them. That should be enough for you. You don't need to hear all of them. And they even eventually call these like martyrologies. They think that somewhere he probably had access to a book which had a list of all the people who were put to death because they stood up for their Jewish faith. So they're heroes, and so the idea of martyrdom also origin here. People have died for their faith for a long time, but the idea of telling stories about people called martyrs is really emphasized here in 2nd Maccabees as well. So this was a great source for Memorial Day, great reading for any time you're thinking about the deceased. So any questions on 1st or 2nd Maccabees? So that gets us to that's taking place in what we now call the 160s BC. Toward the end of the book, we're farther along than that. They do have a little time period where they have some independence, but that ends in 63 BC when the Romans take over. And when Jesus is alive, so Jesus around in the late 20s, around 30s, the Romans are solidly in control at that time. And that's why anytime you see anything with Jesus, it's always with the Romans in the background. But from the Jewish viewpoint, though, when you're saying, what are the Jews looking for in the Messiah? Look what we've studied here. In 721 BC, they get overtaken by the Assyrians. Those that don't are very weak. 586 or 7, all of them get overtaken by the Babylonians, who are very cruel to them. Babylonians get overtaken by the Persians, and we don't get mistreated as much, but we're still under somebody else. The Persians get overtaken by the Greeks. They do these things to us in Maccabees that weren't nice. They get overtaken by the Romans, and at